Claire Whitaker froze in the doorway of her own boardroom. Her 8-year-old daughter stood at the whiteboard, humming marker, squeaking, finishing a probability model that 31 Asteron Dynamics engineers had failed to crack in 6 days. Claire's throat closed. She asked where the girl had learned to do that, and Ava answered. Without turning around the man downstairs, the one with the mop cart, Claire had walked past him in his gray uniform for 2 years and had never once learned his name. When she finally pulled his file, the first line stopped her cold. Before he ever touched a mop, Jack Mercer had been a Navy SEAL. The Asteron Dynamics tower held 2 entirely different companies inside the same 41 floors, and neither one knew the other existed. The first began at 7 in the morning on the executive level, where Claire Whitaker had kept the same corner office since the board named her chief executive 4 years earlier. She had been good at the job before her husband died. After Daniel's heart gave out on a Tuesday 2 winters ago, with no warning and no reason anyone could name, she became something closer to relentless. 14-hour days. 3 nights a week on the leather couch by the window, because driving home to an empty bed at 1 in the morning felt worse than not driving home at all. The work was clean. The work had inputs and outputs. The work never asked her how she was holding up. She had bought her daughter everything a grieving mother could think to buy. A private tutor on Tuesday, a summer engineering camp with a waiting list 2 years deep, a piano delivered by 4 men in a truck that nobody in the house had touched since the day it arrived. Ava was 8. Her 2nd grade teacher had used the phrase difficulty integrating at a conference Claire attended by phone from an airport, and Claire had written it down without understanding that the girl was not struggling with the material, but drowning in how slow it was. Ava finished the worksheets in 4 minutes and spent the other 26 looking out the window. She had stopped mentioning it because mentioning it had never changed anything. Most evenings, she sat on the floor of the 41st floor lobby with a book she had already read, waiting for her mother to be done. The 2nd company started at 10 at night. Jack Mercer clocked in at the loading dock, pulled the gray uniform shirt over the t-shirt he had worn all day, and worked the building until 6 in the morning. Trash floors and the coffee rings executives left on glass conference tables and never thought about again. His badge had been printed wrong on his first day, Mercier, with an extra letter. And in 2 years, nobody had noticed, including him, because nobody had ever needed to say his name out loud. I was 37, and he had a rule he had never written down anywhere. Never be memorable to the executive floor. Nod step aside. Keep the cart moving. Men who got noticed got discussed, and men who got discussed ended up in files. He had reasons. His wife had been Maya. 2.5 years of treatment. 3 hospitals. 1 clinical trial that looked like a miracle for 11 weeks, and then stopped looking like anything at all. She died when Owen was 4. The insurance, what it covered, and the rest arrived in envelopes. He was still paying down at $240 a month. Owen was 7 now. He had not spoken to a stranger without gripping his father's sleeve since the funeral, and he ran on a schedule the way other children run on sugar. Breakfast at 6:40. Same bowl, same chair, same window. Jack had built the architecture of his life around standing at that counter when the boy came down the hall, rubbing his eyes. The night shift was not a philosophy. It was a solution, and it was under review. Maya's parents had filed in the spring for partial custody, and their attorney's language was surgical in the way that expensive language always is. Unstable environment. Nocturnal employment. Financial precarity. The petition argued in 100 careful words that a man who mopped floors could not give a child a stable life. The hearing was set for the first week of February. 4 months away. So Jack kept his head down, kept his cart moving and made certain that nobody on the executive floor of Asteron Dynamics would ever have a reason to learn his name. That held for 2 years. It ended on a Thursday in October because of a whiteboard. The trouble with the Orion system had started 6 days earlier as a rounding error. Nobody could reproduce, and by that Thursday, it had swallowed the boardroom on 7. Scott Brennan's engineering team had colonized the space with whiteboards, laptops, and cold food, and one board in the corner held a probability tree. They had abandoned 2 nights before, half-drawn 4 branches deep, marked at the bottom with a red question mark. Claire came back from a call at 8 in the evening and found her daughter standing in front of it. Ava had climbed onto a chair to reach. She was humming the marker squeaking, and she had carried the abandoned branch all the way out to its end. A clean, brutal piece of conditional probability. The team had walked away from because they were convinced the answer lay somewhere else entirely, when Claire asked where she had learned that the girl did not turn around. "The man downstairs," she said. "The one with the mop cart." Claire took the service elevator to B2 without telling anyone where she was going. She found them in the staff break room under a fluorescent panel that flickered on the left side, a folding table with a bad hinge, a stack of paper pulled from the recycling bin printed on one side with somebody's expense report, 3 coins on the tabletop, and a paper cup turned upside down beside them, arranged into what Claire recognized after a moment as a physical model of a probability question. The mop cart stood against the wall, with the wringer handle still up. Ava had a pencil in her fist and her tongue between her teeth. Jack sat across from her with his forearms flat on the table, saying nothing at all, waiting. And her daughter was laughing. That was the part that took Claire apart. Not the stranger. Not the basement. She had not seen the child laugh like that, loose, unguarded mid-thought, in more than a year, and she had not been the one to cause it. And she understood in one clean second that she was not looking at a violation. She was looking at evidence. So she did what people do when they own something they are not ready to see. She said Ava's name in the voice she used with the board, and told her to get her coat. Jack stood. He did not apologize, and he did not rush to explain himself, which unsettled her further. 4 months earlier, he said he had come around a corner on 11 at 9 at night and found the girl on the floor outside a conference room, running number sequences on a sheet of paper somebody had thrown away. He gave her a harder one. She solved it and asked for another. Claire told him it was over, that if she found her daughter down here again, there would be a conversation with human resources. She heard how it sounded coming out of her mouth and said it anyway. Jack picked up the paper cup and dropped it in the bin. The only thing he said before she left was that the girl did not need more easy problems. She needed one person who believed she could do hard ones. Claire went upstairs, put Ava in the car, and at 11:40 that night opened the personnel system and typed a note into an employee record. She did not know what a line in a file costs a man with a custody hearing in February. Jack did. Drove home at 6:15 and sat in his truck outside his own building for 20 minutes with the engine off, doing the only arithmetic he was still good at, how much a single document could weigh in front of a judge. Then he went inside, washed his hands, and had eggs on the table when Owen came down the hall at 6:40. Ava did not argue. That was the part Claire had not braced for. 3 days later, the girl stopped doing math altogether. The background report Claire had ordered came back the following Wednesday, 4 pages in a plain folder, and she read the first page twice. Jack Mercer had enlisted at 20. SEAL Team 3. 3 deployments. His specialization was listed in the flat vocabulary of military paperwork reconnaissance navigation pattern analysis, probability modeling, risk assessment, And after his discharge, the record kept going in a direction she had not expected. 2 years as a logistics consultant for a freight firm in Norfolk. 18 months as an adjunct lecturer in applied mathematics at a state university. Then, nothing. A 3-year gap, blank as a wall. And on the other side of it, a night maintenance application, Asteron Dynamics, submitted with no references and no explanation for the missing time. The file told her exactly what the man had been and refused to tell her the only thing she wanted to know, which was why he had stopped. She was still holding it when Wesley Hart knocked on the frame of her door. Wesley had been her chief operating officer for 3 years, and she had hired him herself over 2 candidates the search firm preferred. He was the first call when anything broke, and the last man on the floor most nights, and he had brought 2 members onto her board during the expansion, both of whom still deferred to him. That evening, he came in with 2 coffees set, one in front of her, and told her not to worry about the board, that he would handle the board, and she should handle the demonstration. She was grateful. She said so, because the Orion problem was no longer a rounding error. Orion was a logistics coordination platform. Asteron had spent $387 million building, and in 5 days it went in front of federal evaluators who would decide a contract worth the next decade of the company. For nearly 2 weeks, the system had been producing outputs that were subtly, consistently, unaccountably wrong. Not crashes, not errors. Answers that looked entirely reasonable and were not true. 31 engineers had gone through it line by line. Scott Brennan had rebuilt the validation layer twice. They found nothing because there was nothing in the code to find. And every hour they spent looking made Claire more certain that she was going to walk onto a stage and hand a federal evaluation team a machine that told confident lies. She was on the phone about it in her kitchen on Thursday night when her daughter spoke from the doorway. Ava had been silent for most of a week. She said that if the machine was running right and the answer was still wrong, then the machine wasn't the problem, and you were supposed to check what you put into it before you started tearing it apart. Claire lowered the phone and asked her where that came from. The girl looked at her with an expression far too level for 8 years old and said that Ma Mercer had told her that, and that it didn't matter anymore because her mother had made it so she wasn't allowed to see him. Then she went to bed. Claire stood in the kitchen a long while after that. She thought about 31 engineers and a folding table with a bad hinge, and about a man who had told her without any particular emotion that her daughter needed someone who believed she could do hard things. At 12:50 in the morning, she got in her car and drove back to the building. She took the service elevator down to B2 with the folder under her arm. The fluorescent panel was still flickering on the left side, and Jack Mercer was 30 feet down the corridor with his back to her, running the mop cart along the baseboard. She had come to ask a man she had threatened to fire to save $400 million. She had not worked out what she would say when he asked her why he should. He heard the elevator and turned, and when he saw who it was, he set the mop handle back in the wringer and waited. Claire told him what was happening to Orion. The 31 engineers, the 2 weeks the federal evaluation on Monday morning. Then she asked him for 3 hours with the system. Jack said no. It was not hostile. That was what made it land. He explained it the way a man explains a load-bearing wall. She could dislike it, but it was not going to move. He had a custody hearing in February, and Maya's parents' attorney had already built an argument out of the shape of his life. He could not afford to appear anywhere inside the internal investigation of a defense contractor in any document, in any capacity. One subpoenaed personnel note was all it would take. Claire heard the words custody hearing and finally understood what her line in the file had actually been. She asked him why he had taught Ava for 4 months, then if he was that careful. Jack said nobody ever looked in the basement. Not until Thursday. She had no answer for that. So she stood in a flickering corridor at 1 in the morning and let the silence work. And after a while, he gave her his terms. The lessons with Ava resumed, and his name went into no document, no memo, no incident report, nothing that could ever be printed out and slid across a table by an attorney. Claire agreed to both before she had thought through whether she could deliver either. Scott Brennan met her in the boardroom on 7 at 7 the next morning and told her in the tone of a man protecting his own people that bringing a maintenance employee into an Orion audit was going to look like panic. She let him say all of it. Then she told him about SEAL Team 3 and reconnaissance and pattern analysis and a university lectureship in applied mathematics, and watched his objection change shape without disappearing. Scott gave him 3 hours. Supervised. That was the deal. Jack came up at 9 that Friday morning in the gray uniform because he had come straight off shift and because he had no reason to own anything else. 11 engineers stopped talking when he walked in. Somebody's laptop kept playing a video in the corner until they realized and shut it. He did not sit down at a terminal. He did not ask for repository access. He stood at the end of the long glass table, studied the wall of whiteboards for a while, and then asked the room a single question. Who touches the data before it enters the system? Nobody answered. Scott started to say that the ingest pipeline was automated and stopped because automated is not the same as untouched, and every person in that room knew it. Data came in from 4 regional partners, passed through a normalization layer, hit a validation gateway, and was handed to Orion as clean truth. And not one of the 31 people who had spent 2 weeks tearing the machine apart could say with certainty who held authority over any of those steps. The silence went on long enough to become an answer. Jack asked how far back the ingest logs went. 90 days. Scott told him all 4 sources time-stamped. He asked for those and for the full error record, and then he asked for one more thing, which made a junior engineer laugh before she caught herself. He asked for a clean whiteboard. He worked at that whiteboard for 3 hours and never touched a line of code. What he did instead looked to the engineers, watching like something out of another profession entirely. He laid the errors along a horizontal time axis, every one of them, going back 14 days. Above it, he built a second axis for the data clusters, grouped by which regional source they had arrived from. Below it, a third for processing windows. Then he stopped looking for what was wrong and started looking for what was regular. Scott had been running those same errors through statistical analysis for a week and found nothing because he had been treating them as noise, and noise is what you get when you average across the wrong axis. Jack was not averaging. He was doing what he had been trained to do at 22 on a ridge line with a notebook watching a road for 4 days to learn the difference between traffic and intention. By the second hour, the room had gone quiet in a different way. The errors were not distributed across the day. Every corrupted output, without exception across 14 days, traced back to data that had entered the system between 3:10 and 4:40 in the morning. And within that window, all of it had come through one validation, gateway out of 4. One gateway. 90 minutes. 14 days. Scott said it looked like a scheduled batch conflict. Jack said scheduled batch conflicts do not skip weekends. There had been no errors on either Saturday. A young engineer near the window asked where he had learned to do this. Jack said he had done some work in freight logistics, which was true, and left everything else where it was. But Claire was in the doorway by then, and she had read the file, and she was watching a man rebuild a problem by refusing to accept its framing, which was precisely what he had been doing with 3 coins and a paper cup on a folding table in the basement. She had not understood until that moment that they were the same activity. At 11:50, Scott pulled the ingest authorization records for the 3 to 5 window and found that the gateway in question had been running under a service credential provisioned 11 days before the first error appeared. Nobody in the room recognized it. Jack asked how the validation thresholds were set, how much variance a data field was permitted before the system flagged it. Scott gave him the numbers. Jack wrote them on the board beside the drift he had mapped, and the 2 columns sat there together, and the whole room understood what it was looking at before anyone said it out loud. The corruption had never once been large enough to trip a flag, not in 14 days, not across 400,000 records. That is not decay. Decay does not respect a ceiling. Somebody had known exactly where the ceiling was. Scott sat down slowly and asked what he was supposed to tell the board. Claire told him he was not going to tell the board anything yet, and heard her own voice come out steady, while something underneath it went cold. On the whiteboard behind them, the demonstration date sat in the corner in Scott's handwriting, circled twice from back when it had still felt like a deadline instead of a countdown. It was Friday morning. The federal evaluation team would be in the building at 9 o'clock Monday. 72 hours. Orion was not broken. Orion had never been broken. Somebody had been lying to it. Nobody mentioned the 3 hours again. They spent Friday afternoon walking the credential backward, and by 4 o'clock they had it. The service account had been provisioned through an administrative session that originated inside the building on the corporate network from a machine registered in the asset inventory as Workstation 4B. Scott read the asset record aloud twice. 4th floor, Executive Operations Suite, the office of the Chief Operating Officer. Claire stood up. She got as far as saying she wanted legal and security in a room in 10 minutes, and Wesley Hart's access frozen before he left the building that evening. And then Jack said her name. It was the first time he had used it. He told her she had just done the exact thing he spent every session teaching her daughter not to do. She had taken a single input and believed it on arrival. Claire turned on him harder than she meant to and said the log was not an opinion. Jack agreed that it was not. The log established that the credential had been created from that machine. It established nothing about whose hands were on the keyboard. A workstation left unlocked over a lunch hour is a gift. And if somebody had spent months learning the exact variance tolerance of a $400 million validation layer, that person was patient enough to consider where the trail would eventually point, and to make sure it pointed somewhere useful. Then he said the thing that stopped her. If she walked into a room and accused her chief operating officer on the strength of one log entry, and she was wrong, she would hand him the cleanest possible story about a chief executive who had lost her judgment. And if she was right, she would be telling him he had been found 72 hours before he needed to know anything at all. Scott, who had spent 2 weeks hunting a bug and had now spent one afternoon in a different universe, asked what they were supposed to do instead. Jack said they were supposed to keep asking. Session duration. Badge records for the 4th floor on the night the credential was made. Whether anything else had been provisioned from that machine in the same window. Whether the person who did it had ever logged in twice from anywhere. Claire heard her daughter's voice in her own kitchen. Check what you put into it before you start tearing it apart, and understood that the man had never been teaching Ava arithmetic at all. He had been teaching her a discipline, and the lessons were all the same lesson. The answer he had told the girl is the cheapest thing in a problem. They worked until 7. The badge record showed 4 people on the 4th floor after 10 that night. Wesley Hart was one of them. So were 3 others, and that was exactly as far as it went. Claire made herself sit with the incompleteness instead of closing the gap with the version she already believed. At 7:20, she went up to 41 to change because she was not going home and found a message her assistant had left on the desk. Wesley had asked for 30 minutes with her in the morning. Privately. Off the calendar. She stood there, holding the slip of paper with the whiteboard numbers still burning behind her eyes, and understood that she was about to sit across a table from a man and pretend she had not spent the day inside his office. 61 hours. He did not come after her. That was what she had not prepared for. Wesley arrived at 8 on Saturday morning with 2 coffees, the way he always did, and he was warm and he was worried, and he sat down across from her and put a folder on the desk between them. Inside it was Jack Mercer's service record. He had pulled it through corporate security the previous afternoon, which he was entitled to do, which was in fact his job, and laid it out with the reluctance of a man doing something distasteful for everyone's good. A maintenance contractor with no engineering credentials had been given access to a federal contract system by the chief executive personally, without a security review 72 hours before evaluation. Then he turned to the second page and set one finger under the 3-year gap. 3 unaccounted years, he said, in the history of a man trained in reconnaissance. I was not accusing him of anything. He wanted her to hear that clearly. He was only saying that when the evaluators asked how a non-standard individual had been given access to Orion, and they would ask the company needed a better answer than the chief executive liked him. So he recommended suspending Mercer's access immediately and referring the matter to legal for a formal review of the access breach. A formal review. In writing. With a name in it. Claire understood the geometry of it in about 4 seconds, and it was beautiful. The way a trap is beautiful once you are standing in it. If she fought to protect a night janitor against a documented security concern, she announced that the man mattered to her, which meant the man had found something, which meant she was investigating. If she let it go, she lost the only person in the building who understood what was actually happening to Orion. Either way, Jack ended up in a file 4 months before a judge decided where his son slept. She told Wesley she would think about it. He said, of course, touched the doorframe on his way out, and told her again not to worry about the board. The second document was already on her desk when she turned around in an envelope her assistant had left on Friday, and she had not opened. It was a contingency plan, and it had been circulated in hard copy to her and to the 2 directors Wesley had brought in during the expansion. It was framed as prudence, and it read like prudence. In the event the Orion demonstration did not meet evaluation criteria, the memo proposed a temporary consolidation of operational authority under the Office of the Chief Operating Officer, pending a stabilization review with a defined pathway to a permanent transition of executive responsibility. If metrics did not recover within 2 quarters, the revision date on the last page was 6 weeks old. 6 weeks. The first Orion error was 12 days old. Claire read it 3 times. Then she called down to 7 and was told that Jack had gone home at 6 that morning as he always did, and that he had left something with Scott. It was an envelope with her name on it, and 1 page inside. I was resigning effective immediately. He was grateful for the access. Scott's team now had everything he had found. The window, the gateway, the tolerance ceiling, the credential. There was 1 more line at the bottom in the same flat handwriting. He wrote that he had a son who needed him more than a building did, and that he thought she of all people would understand. Folded into the crease was his badge, the one that had said Mercier for 2 years. 48 hours. The only man who could solve it had walked out of the building. Saturday went nowhere. Scott's team spent it rerunning everything Jack had left them and confirming over and over that he had been right about all of it. And that being right was not the same as being finished. They had a window, a gateway, a ceiling, and a credential that pointed at a machine instead of a man. By Sunday afternoon, they had not moved an inch. Claire drove to Harlow Street that evening. The address in the personnel file led to a second-floor apartment in a building with a stairwell that smelled like other people's cooking. She brought Ava because Ava had asked, and because she had made a promise in a basement corridor at 1 in the morning and was not going to break it in the same week. Jack opened the door in a flannel shirt and did not look surprised. Owen was at the kitchen table with a tray of pattern blocks, and when he saw a stranger, he moved his chair 4 inches closer to his father and did not look up again. Ava sat down across from him without being asked and started building on the same tray. And after 2 minutes, the boy began quietly correcting her. On the refrigerator, there was a photograph of a dark-haired woman holding a much smaller version of Owen, and beside it, a printed schedule with the meals of the day written out in 24-hour time. Claire told Jack she was not there to talk him out of anything. Then she asked about the 3 years. He got 2 cups down and poured coffee. Neither of them drank and told her. The last deployment. He had run the route assessment. The man whose job was to take everything they knew and convert it into a number other men would trust with their lives. He gave the number 12%. Command accepted it. The route went. 3 men did not come back. The number was not wrong, he said. He had run it correctly. He would run it the same way today. The data was wrong. 1 human source in the chain had been compromised, and the reporting that fed his model had been shaped by somebody who wanted that road to look empty. He had known the source was thin. He flagged it once, then let it go, because they were 40 minutes from a decision window, and everyone was tired, and the model came out clean. He had checked the arithmetic. The arithmetic had been perfect. He had not checked the assumption. Claire asked if that was why he left. He said that was why he stopped trusting answers. An answer arrives finished and grateful and asks nothing of you. And that is exactly what makes it dangerous. What he trusted now were the questions he had asked before the answer existed, and she saw it whole, the folding table, the coins, the 4 months of harder problems, and no solutions. It was not a teaching philosophy he had picked up somewhere. It was the one thing he had carried out of the worst day of his life, and he had been handing it to her daughter in a basement because it was all he owned that was worth giving away. It was also exactly how he had found the fault in Orion. He had never looked at the machine. He had looked at what the machine had been told. The 3 years came after, he said. He left the university 9 months into Maya's diagnosis. Then the treatment, and a 4-year-old, who would not sleep unless somebody was in the room, and the envelopes. When he came out the other side, he needed work that ended at 6 in the morning, and it turned out the market for that. He said it without any weight on it at all. Less money, he told her. But he was there every morning. Claire looked past him at the table where her daughter was working on something hard, with her face completely open. She had bought that child a tutor, a summer program, and a piano. She drove home at 9 with the radio off, and was still 4 blocks away when Ava spoke from the back seat. The girl said that Mr. Mercer knew she hated long division. She said he knew she liked prime numbers, and that she counted them when she couldn't sleep, and that he had never once told her that was strange. Then she asked her mother what she knew about her. Claire started to answer, and discovered that everything available to her was a purchase. The name of the tutor, what the camp had cost. She said something about how hard she had been working, and that it was all for her, and Ava let her finish. "Dad's gone," the girl said. She was not crying, which was the part that took Claire's hands off the wheel at the light and left them shaking on her knees. She said it evenly, the way she said everything, as a thing she had already worked out and checked twice. She said she didn't want to wait for her mother anymore. Claire got her into bed at 10. At 10:40, the phone rang. It was Scott Brennan, with a quality in his voice she had never heard in 4 years. They had followed Jack's last instruction, the one about whether anything else had been provisioned from that machine, and it had taken them somewhere. None of them had thought to look. The credential was not the only thing that had been set up. 3 weeks earlier, the network routing for the demonstration auditorium had been quietly reconfigured. The room's uplink no longer ran on Asteron's primary network at all. It ran through a secondary relay leased from an outside provider. That was the question Jack had left him written on the back of the envelope. If a man had been preparing this for months, why would he build only one way to win? Scott had staged a full dry run on the exact configuration scheduled for Monday morning because he wanted to be certain before he called her. 90 seconds into the simulation, every display in the auditorium went black. I had spent 2 hours trying to bring it back and gotten nowhere because the failure was not in Orion and not in the building. It sat on the other side of a relay he did not own and could not reach. If the demonstration ran as currently configured, he told her, they would fail in front of the federal evaluation team. Claire drove back to the tower at 11 at night. She called her general counsel from the car and laid all of it out. The ingest window, the tolerance ceiling, the credential. From Workstation 4. The relay, the contingency memo revised. 6 weeks before the first error appeared. The attorney listened to everything and then told her what she already knew and had been refusing to hold. Every piece was circumstantial alone. The credential put a machine in the story, not a ma. The relay was leased through a third-party vendor with no visible connection to anyone inside the company. The memo was a document a competent operating officer could plausibly have written. And she could not take an incomplete case to a board when 2 of its members had been seated by the man she was accusing, because the moment she did, the story stopped being about sabotage and became a story about a chief executive hunting inside her own leadership team on the eve of the largest evaluation in the company's history. She needed the link between Wesley Hart and that relay. Without it, there was no case. She could not cancel the demonstration without proving she had lost control of her own system. She could not walk onto that stage with a room that would go dark in 90 seconds. She hung up, walked past the 7th floor, and past her own office into an empty conference room on 41, sat down in the first chair she reached, and did not get up. She had lost the company and her daughter in the same 18 hours. 9 hours until the evaluators arrived. Her phone lit up on the table beside her face up, and the name on the screen was Jack Mercer. Scott had called him. That was the whole explanation Jack offered on the phone, and he was in the lobby 20 minutes later, in the same flannel shirt with Owen asleep against his shoulder, because there had been nobody to leave him with at midnight. Claire came down to meet him. She started to say she could not ask him for this, and he told her she wasn't asking. And then he said the rest of it, while the boy breathed against his neck. He was withdrawing the resignation. I wanted his name in the record, the access logs, the incident report, whatever went to the board in the morning. In writing where an attorney could find it in February. She told him what that could cost him. Jack said he had spent 3 years being extremely careful, and that being careful had not once been the same thing as being right. His son was going to grow up in a world where a man either walks past a thing or he doesn't, and he would rather explain a document to a judge than explain the other version to Owen. They put the boy on the couch in Claire's office with her coat over him, and then they went down to 7 and worked. Scott's people spent the night rebuilding the auditorium uplink onto the primary network, physically cable by cable, because nobody was willing to trust a configuration file anymore. By 4 in the morning, it was done with a temporary failover path stitched in as insurance, and no time to load test either one properly. Jack did not touch any of it. He sat at the end of the glass table with the vendor paperwork for the leased relay and did to it what he had done to Orion. The relay was leased to a limited liability company registered in Delaware with no website and no employees. Scott had already run its name against every name in the executive directory and gotten nothing, which was where the trail had stopped. Jack asked what assumption they had been testing. Scott said they had been looking for Wesley Hart. Jack said that was the assumption. A man who had spent months learning the tolerance ceiling of a validation layer was never going to attach his own name to a shell company. But somebody had to sign something, and whoever signed it had to be a person he could control, which meant somebody close to him, not somebody clever. The filing listed a single member. The surname was not Hart. The address was a townhouse in Bethesda. At 5:40 in the morning, Scott found that same address on an emergency contact form in Wesley Hart's own onboarding paperwork, submitted 3 years earlier in the week Claire hired him. His sister. That was the link. The relay, the shell, the sister, the memo, the credential, the ceiling, the window. It closed. Claire built the file at 6 in the morning on a laptop in the boardroom on 7, and she built it in the order. Jack had taught an 8-year-old to build things, not from the conclusion backward, but from the inputs forward. What entered the system? Who authorized it? What was created from that machine? What was routed away from the building, and who owned the thing it was routed to? What document had been revised 6 weeks before any of it began, and what that document would have delivered? She read it through once, then called her general counsel and read it to him. And he was quiet a while, and then said one word, which was yes. At 6:50, she went up to 41 to change. Owen was still asleep under her coat, and Jack sat on the floor beside the couch, with his back against the desk awake. She put on the gray suit and pinned her hair up with hands that had finally stopped shaking. Then she called her assistant and asked her to put Wesley Hart on the 7:15, because whatever happened in that room, she was not going to let him hear about it secondhand and build a story around her absence. At 7:15, she knocked on the boardroom door, where 9 directors were waiting, who had been told only that the meeting was mandatory. She did not sit down. She put the evidence on the screen in the order she had built it, and walked them through it without adjectives, the 90-minute ingest window, the single validation gateway, the drift that never once crossed a threshold, the credential provisioned from Workstation 4, the auditorium uplink, rerouted 3 weeks before anyone knew there was a problem, the Delaware entity, the townhouse in Bethesda, and the emergency contact form from 3 years earlier. She put the contingency memo up last, with the revision date visible in the corner. Wesley Hart sat at the far end of the table, present as chief operating officer, and without a vote, and he did not move through any of it. When she finished, he did exactly what she expected, because there was only one card on the table, and it was the one he had dealt himself. He said this was what happened to a company when its chief executive stopped being able to tell the difference between grief and judgment. The entire chain, he said, rested on the work of a night maintenance employee with no clearance, no credentials, and 3 unaccounted years in a military record, whom she had personally admitted to a federal contract system without a security review. He asked the room whether they were seriously prepared to put a $400 million evaluation in the hands of a man who mopped the floors. One of the directors he had brought in during the expansion turned in his chair to see how Claire would answer. She said that the man had found in 3 hours what 31 engineers had not found in 2 weeks, and that the question in front of the board was not why she trusted him. The question she told them was why nobody in that building had asked his name in 2 years. The room did not applaud. Boards do not applaud. But the director, who had turned in his chair, looked down at the emergency contact form on the screen and did not look up again. And when the vote came, it was unanimous. Wesley Hart was suspended pending investigation, and his credentials revoked at 8:14. At 8:57, Claire watched from her office window as 2 people from corporate security walked him across the plaza to the visitor lot, and she felt nothing she could name. The evaluators arrived at 9. The auditorium held about 140 people. The board, the program office, and 20 of Asteron's own engineers, who had earned a seat by not sleeping. Jack sat in the front row in the flannel shirt, because Claire had put him there and refused every argument he made about it. Owen sat beside him with the pattern blocks. Claire opened without a single slide. She told them the system had been sabotaged from inside the company, who had done it, and what had been done about it that morning, because the alternative was letting them find out in a filing in 6 weeks. Then she told them the rest: the folding table in the basement, the recycled paper, her own daughter, and the man in the front row. She said his name twice. Once as the night maintenance employee who had been in the building for 2 years, and once as a former member of SEAL Team 3, who had spent a career learning the difference between what a system reports and what is actually true. She said Asteron had held the answer inside the building the whole time and could not see it, because everyone had been trained to look for competence only where it arrives with a title. Then, Scott ran Orion. The final sequence put 47 simultaneous logistics chains through the system, and the room watched them resolve in 11 seconds. The senior evaluator asked him to run it again. Scott told the room what that first number actually was. The uplink had been rebuilt by hand overnight and never tested under load. So he had deliberately sent the first pass through the temporary failover path, rather than gamble the demonstration on 8 hours of untested cable. It had worked, which meant he could now do the thing he had wanted to do all morning. He ran it a second time on the primary network. 9 seconds. That was Orion. That had always been Orion. The applause started somewhere in the middle of the room and took the whole auditorium with it. And Claire stood at the podium and watched the federal evaluator not clap at all. He stood up instead and walked straight down the aisle toward the front row. He stopped in front of Jack, put out his hand, and asked whether he had ever run risk assessment for a program office. Jack shook the hand, said that he had a long time ago, and that he was going to stay where he was. Asteron was awarded the contract 11 days later. The internal investigation confirmed the chain in full, and Wesley Hart was terminated for cause, and what came after belonged to federal prosecutors, and took considerably longer. 14 months later, the 9th floor of the Asteron Tower looked nothing like it had. Claire had spent the first 3 months after Orion doing something the board found harder to understand than the sabotage itself: walking the building at night. She learned the names of the people who cleaned it and found out that a dishwasher in the cafeteria had a daughter working through a second-hand calculus textbook at the kitchen table. Then she took an empty floor and gave it away. It was open to the family of every person who drew a paycheck from the company, at any level, at no cost. And Claire asked Jack to design the program because nobody else in the building was qualified to. He accepted. He also declined twice, and then a third time in writing the executive title. The board kept trying to attach to it because the position came with days, and he still worked nights. Owen was 8 now, and still needed breakfast at 6:40, and Jack was still standing at that counter every morning when the boy came down the hall. The custody petition had been withdrawn in January, 3 weeks before the hearing. He had named the program himself. The plaque by the elevator on 9 said, "The Open Table," and almost nobody who walked past it knew it was named for a folding table with a bad hinge still standing against the wall of the staff break room on B2. Ava taught on Wednesdays. She was 9. She had 11 students, most of them younger, and in the first month, a few parents quietly complained to Claire because the child would not tell anyone the answer. She would take a problem, cut it into pieces, hand back the pieces, and wait. Claire had overheard her explain it once to a frustrated 7-year-old. Anybody could give him the answer. And the answer was the cheapest thing in the whole problem. Owen worked with the smallest ones on spatial reasoning, using the same pattern blocks. He talked to strangers now, which had taken most of a year. Jack taught the adult sessions on Tuesdays and Thursdays. And in the fall, he had enrolled part-time to finish the applied mathematics degree he had left behind in another lifetime. His badge had been reprinted in the first week. Claire had put in the request herself, and it had taken a form and approval and 4 minutes. She still ran Asteron and still worked the hours the job demanded most weeks. But she left at 5 on Fridays, and on Wednesdays, she sat at the back of room 904 and watched her daughter teach. That was where she was the afternoon she looked up from her phone and found the whole thing in front of her at once. Jack was at a table across the room with a maintenance technician's teenage son, a scratch pad between them, and a problem on it that had clearly been sitting a while. His forearms were flat on the table. He was not writing. He was not talking. He was waiting exactly as he had waited. The first night she came down to B2 and found him under a flickering light with 3 coins and an upside-down paper cup, letting her daughter be wrong for as long as she needed to be. The gray uniform was hanging in a locker downstairs because his shift started at 10. A person's worth is not in the uniform or the salary or the title on the badge, and sometimes the badge is spelled wrong for 2 years and nobody notices. Some people stand in a small place, not because they could not climb, but because they weighed what was up there against what was waiting at home and chose. And sometimes, the one holding the answer is the person everyone has walked past every single day without ever once looking up.